screen here is on. Okay, fantastic. So I just want to say a good evening and a very warm welcome to the Wiener Holocaust Library. For those of you who have not joined us before, for those of you who have, welcome back. My name is Kira Fitzgerald. I'm the library's education officer. And before we start the event, I just wanted to outline some general housekeeping to get the boring stuff out of the way. So this talk, or conversation rather, will last approximately for half an hour before we open up the floor to questions. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to take any online questions this evening, but also a very warm welcome to those joining us online. After this, we would also love for you to join us at the drinks reception, which is also why some of you who are inquiring about drinks earlier have been put on hold till after the talk has been completed. We're not expecting the fire alarm to go off, so if it does go off, please exit the building back the way through which you entered. And if you need to use the restroom at any stage, it's down the corridor just to my left, down one flight in the lift to the Noor Inayat Khan, A Life of Courage. It's an event I've been particularly looking forward to, as I'm actually currently researching the fascinating career of Noor and the incredible work of Shrabani for my doctoral thesis. So it was a real honour to be asked to host this event this evening. On the 13th of September 1944, Noor Inayat Khan, a World War II British secret agent, was murdered by the Nazis in Dachau concentration camp. For her bravery, she was posthumously awarded the George Cross by Britain and the Croix de Guerre by France. Tonight, the Noor Inayat Khan Memorial Trust and the Wiener Holocaust Library invite you to remember her life and courage in a rare UK conversation between Noor's nephew, Pirzia Inayat Khan, a Sufi scholar, head of the forgive me for my pronunciation of this, Inayat, fabulous, and founder of the Sulek Academy, Noor's biographer, Shrabani Basu, author of Spy Princess, and chair of the Noor Inayat Khan Memorial Trust, and Sheikh Alma Sheikh, Noor's cousin and the only person in this room to have met and known Noor. Without further ado, please join me in giving a warm welcome to our speakers this evening.
Thank you so much, Kira. It's really apt that we are here today at the Wiener Library, so thank you for supporting us in this. I just wanted to say before we talk about Noor, there were 4 women who were killed on the same day, on the 13th. They were all secret agents, so today we do remember all of them. And their names were Noor Inayat Khan, Madeleine Demarmont, Eliane Plumen, and Yolande Beekman. And all 4 were secret agents. They were all from the SOE, and they were all brutally killed. So We remember them all today. But today is about Noor, and what a privilege to have Sheikh Al-Mashayikh here with us today, because he was the only one in this room. He is the only one in this room who actually knew Noor. So we're going to get some lovely stories. And Pir Zia, of course, he has been looking after her archives, he has been finding material, and ever since the book was published, I have got to know Pir Zia, and I've kept in touch with the family, with all of them right through. And every time he discovers something, he sends it to me, and it's always a nugget. So we're going to go through many of the things today, and basically see, where was Noor coming from? What is this background that we can bring, find out about her? We know about her wartime life, but what is it that drove her? This journey, that she went on. And I'm going to start, as I said, with Sheikh Al-Mashayikh, the only person who knew Noor. You were about 9 years old when you first met her?
Oh, no.
Let's get the mic. Yeah. No, we just... Yeah.
Thank you. I knew her much earlier, but not as early as Noor knew me. Since when I was born, she was already a grown girl, not a teenager quite, but she was 12, 13 years old. And at that time, her father, Hazrat Inayat Khan, had started encouraging her to take up contact with the family in India, in Baroda. So she started writing little chits, little letters about them, to them. And so in one of these earliest letters, in a very childish hand, she writes that now we have a little cousin, and his name is Mahmoud. I didn't know her, she knew me. Later on, of course, I knew her very well indeed, and it's so hard to do. I wish, I were a poet or a painter, and unfortunately I'm none of the two. But if I had been a poet or a painter, I could have evoked something of that personality of Noor Nissa in a way which now I had to try to specify just in a few dull words. But there was something extraordinary about her. Her father had overwhelming charisma. He himself had in turn inherited from his own grandfather. And both these two elder children of his, the eldest one was Noor, and her brother Vilayat, the later Pir Vilayat, they also had that extraordinary kind of charisma. Anybody, if you would have known Pir Vilayat, maybe, then you can understand, you get a somewhat image of that same kind of quality which Noor had. And it was fairly small. Well, I thought, of course, as a small boy, I thought she was quite tall. But in fact, she was quite petite, quite small, but very, very lively, very intense also. And, well, a very, very... one of those people of whom, when you talk to her, when you just see her come, something lovely seems to go out from her, just to reach you, the particular person with whom she was happened to be dealing. So that was that extraordinary thing, and I kind of suspect that even when she was in a tragic Nazi captivity, something of that must even have impressed these awful jailers of hers. Before that, of course, she was transported in an awful way to the destruction camps. But there was something on the one hand very focused, very tense, at the same time with a kind of joie de vivre, which always came out of her in all different conditions when you met. She was also had a high-pitched voice, which made her sound very enthusiastic about things. And, well, that was the way she communicated with us all.
Mm-hmm. You have a lovely story when I was researching the book and we spoke about how she taught you music. So will you share that with us,
yes,
everybody here?
If you don't yet know that, we're often asked to tell that story. You see, Noor and also her sister and brothers came to stay. We were in Holland. They came to stay in Holland for some months, or quite a long time, several weeks, sometimes a month, with another family of friends of Sufi Murids, but very leading person in persons. And so they used to stay with her. And then, of course, they came to visit us. And my father, knowing, of course, all her versatility in music, she played the harp, but she also played the piano. And so, why don't you try to teach her music to that little Mahmoud? He really should get some experience of music, so please do something about it. She was very enthusiastic. Don't forget that she studied, her study was child psychology. And so the many stories she wrote in those days, in those years, were precisely attuned to that psychology she was studying, always some kind of something to penetrate which a child might be attracted to but not quite understand, but the point of which could be understood by adults reading those poems, which Bizet has done brilliantly, and he could discuss all his poems. He published all his all products collectively, and so could tell all about these different forms of attention in which he, in her language, it was in that way was given expression. So and then there are some, of course. Oh, I should tell the story.
Yes,
okay.
you have
My
to tell us
said,
the special method she used.
My father just said,
you were very naughty, so he was very naughty, and Noor had to teach him.
Yes, of course, he was naughty, and because my father and uncle were brilliant musicians. Noor herself and her brothers, they all were musicians. I knew nothing, not even playing the piano. So but I know, of course, I was very shy. All these people are such experts, and I know nothing, how terrible it is, how humiliating it is, and how can I possibly cope. All right, Noor came, and what she chose to make me play is the so-called Sonate Facile of Mozart. Now, Mozart is a wonderful composer, but his Sonate Facile is absolutely not facile. So, certainly not a starting student who just has to learn the ABC of the piano. So what did she do to smooth over my problems? She started telling me stories, and stories very akin to the kind of stories which Bizet was citing this afternoon, about, on the one hand, about fairies frolicking around, but also about hares and rabbits dance. Maybe she thought those fairies were a bit abstract for me in my young age, but very much even more about rabbits and hares and all this frolicking in the gardens, and how wonderful it was, that atmosphere and the joy. And she told, in that way, with all these stories, she made me play those notes of Mozart's sonata. And I liked it very much. For there were certain rabbits for the first movement, then we had hares for the second movement, and they had different connotations and different meanings. So a wonderful story she told. And naturally I thought, well, so these stories, these rabbits and these fairies, they of course belong to the music. All right, she gave me some lessons of that kind, and then she had to leave for France again, and it was without a music teacher. But then fortunately her younger sister, Khairunissa, happened to stay with the same friends, and she came to visit my father. He was a very, very different person, looked very different, and was very quiet. She's a very, very self-contained, quiet person. So my father thought, well, anyway, she's a good musician, she knows to play piano, whatever. So let her continue with Mahmoud's piano playing. All right. Khairunissa, normally called Claire, she came, sat next to me, and I started playing. And then I was waiting for the fairies and the rabbits and nothing. Then I tried to remind her that she was failing on the duties to give that music the obvious dimension which they needed. And she was kind of surprised. But what I was saying, she just did not understand what I was saying. And then I said, well, she is no good as a music teacher. Never mind that. If she doesn't know about rabbits and hares and fairies, then she doesn't know about music. So after that first lesson, her lesson ended there, then and there.
Oh dear. So I'm just going to explain, give the family tree to all of you, so you know who's who and where they are. Right. So we have Noor's father, Hazrat Inayat Khan, and when he went to the West, he took Sufism to the West. So he traveled with his brothers, good Indian family, they all traveled together. And so he had two brothers, Mehboob Khan, Musharraf Khan, and they all went. And Sheikh Al-Mashik is the son of Mahmud, right? Mehboob Khan, yes. So he is the son of Mehboob Khan, so Noor's cousin. And now Pir Hidayat had, Pir Hazrat Inayat, Murshid Hazrat Inayat Khan had 4 children. So Noor is the eldest, and then we had Vilayat, then we had Hidayat, and then Claire. Claire is the youngest, whose story you heard, without the rabbits. And Pir Zia here is Vilayat's son. So Noor's, Vilayat, Hidayat, and Claire, and Pir Zia is just giving you the little family tree so that you know who's who and where they are. And Noor was actually very close to Vilayat. They were like in step the whole time.
Yeah.
And that is why when they decided to volunteer for the war effort, it came from Vilayat. And they said, we are Sufis. They had this meeting. They sat in this house in Fazal Manzil. They had this meeting and they said, this is the German army is just on the outskirts of Paris, about to invade. And they decided that they couldn't stand by and watch. So both of them, they had this really important meeting. They said, we are Sufis, we believe in nonviolence, but we can't stand by and watch. And I think Vilayat at that time was a stronger personality. He was absolutely determined. He said, we go to England, we'll volunteer for the war effort. And when they came here, he volunteered for the RAF. And Noor was just following, with her brother, said, well, I'll volunteer for the women's wing. And so she joined the WAF. But Pir Zia, you've heard the stories of Noor. You never met her, of course. But you heard the stories about your aunt from your father, who, when I interviewed him, said he thought of Noor every day of his life. And he would have spoken to you. So what are your earliest memories of your father telling you about Noor? And what did you think? You were a young boy. What did you think of this aunt at that time as a young boy who, your father was saying was such a heroine? Tell us.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for bringing us together. It's on. Yeah.
It's okay.
Thank you for bringing us together, Shrabaniji. And let me say, first of all, that I've noticed over the years that whenever there's been a significant remembrance of Noor, the hand of Shrabaniji has never been far away. In fact, it's been the greater moving force that made all this possible. So that's a very good question. What were my father's recollections of Noor? Of course, he had many recollections, but which were those that he especially chose to pass along?
Mm-hmm.
And certainly I recall all through my life, since my earliest memories, that whenever he spoke of Noor, there were always tears in his eyes. He never had dry eyes. It was a subject that wounded him to the core. He was so, all throughout his life, he carried with him the devastation of having been so close to a person he admired so deeply, he loved so deeply, and then to have learned of what she suffered. It was as if he suffered that too, through his closeness with her, through his empathy. So I absorbed from him this sense of tragedy immediately. And whenever Noor's name was mentioned, it felt very heavy and weighty, even though I didn't know the whole story until later on. But it was a subject that was charged with a kind of sacred intensity that she represented for us an almost impossible paragon of saintly heroism. And at the same time, her story consisted of a tragedy almost too great to discuss. And so that was the atmosphere growing up. And I do remember some of the stories that you've just summarized for us, that he told me how that already, even before the Nazi conquest of of France, just hearing reports in the news of what was going on in Germany, and that the siblings were, well, particularly my father and Noor, were just deeply offended to hear of the actions of the Nazis, because they said it just ran against all of their ideals. It was totally contrary to all that they had been raised to value. Inclusivity, respect for human dignity and life, the sanctity of the great religious traditions of the world and the cultures that follow in the footsteps of the prophets. That people should be divided in this way and humiliated and persecuted, absolutely offended them, and they were wondering how to respond. And already, even before Noor and her family fled to London and then joined the Allied cause, already she was thinking about how she could respond, and it comes through in her stories. Her stories of heroism, and specifically the way in which she saw that the Nazis were co-opting the legacy of the Grimm brothers and pressing that German folklore into their ideological strategy of brainwashing German children and inculcating that in them a kind of exclusivistic narcissistic pride in some kind of imaginary Germanness and hostility toward everything else. And certainly that was far from the intention of the Grimm brothers themselves. They were cosmopolitan, they were pluralistic, and that spirit was one that Noor appreciated. So she wanted to revive the true spirit of the Grimm brothers and show how the fairy tales of all lands are intertwined, and the tales migrate from culture to culture, and you can't try to build a wall around them and say these are the stories, exclusive stories of our people. So she's told stories from many lands, and it was a conscious strategy of rhetorically challenging the ideology of Nazism, not only by showing how the world is interconnected, but also her stories were stories of generosity and kindness and self-sacrifice, and not domination and tyranny and cruelty. Mm-hmm. So that was her first way of meeting the Nazi threat. And then, so my father said, he told the story that you mentioned, which is that as the tanks were approaching Paris, they gathered in a special room in the house where their father had meditated, and they discussed between them what they would do, and that they said two things. One is they saw that these Nazis were involved in a project that was essentially evil, and secondly, they remembered that their father had asked them specifically and said, if France is invaded, what will you do? So he was prescient, he anticipated that. And my father said that he answered his father saying, I wouldn't want to kill. He wanted to take a nonviolent approach. But apparently, what my father told me is that his father didn't seem fully satisfied with that answer, and said, if you eat the bread of a country, you must be prepared to defend that country with your life. So it was remembering that motivated them to make their way to Britain and then to volunteer for the war effort.
You know, that's so interesting that you would say what Hazrat Inayat Khan told them about take a stand. And he would tell them, this again what your father Bir Vilayat said, that he would tell us that you have the blood of Tipu Sultan in your veins. And so Noor's ancestry was from Tipu Sultan, who was the ruler of Mysore. And he was known as the Tiger of Mysore, and he died fighting the British, and his treasures are in the vaults in Windsor Castle and in the V&A, but that's another story. And but Hazrat Inayat Khan would say that, you know, you have Tipu's blood in your veins, and that must have had a profound effect on them. And I see them as, you know, they are Sufis, they are they believe in non-violence. But there's also, in both Hazrat Inayat Khan and them, and you could tell me, there's also the revolutionary streak in them. A little bit of, we've got to do something, we're going to do it.
Well, to be honest, the monarch that my father used to refer to when we were children was Genghis Khan. He said, remember, you are descended from Genghis Khan.
Goodness.
So it wasn't Tipu Sultan. But that was his way of tracing an ancestry. But there's something else, if I may take this moment just to say that, your book was very important for me at a certain point in my life, and I want to just mention that. So I already spoke of how I grew up with a sense of awe toward Noor, but also that awe was mixed with a feeling of just the heaviness of the story and all of the sadness that accompanied it. And so I wanted to admire Noor from a distance and not actually come too close to her story. And but then your book came out, and yeah, there's a sound there. Okay, and I remember having it but not reading it for a while, for a number of months, and I just kept thinking, I know I need to read this, but something was stopping me. And so I started to read it, and it was very difficult. It begins with the idyll of her childhood and the halcyon days of the summer school in Suren and the presence of her father, and then her university years and her stories. But then it goes into her recruitment and her wartime service, and it gets darker and darker, and you feel you're following her on a path that you know is leading into hell. And it's hard to read, especially if you have a connection with Noor or any kind of sympathetic feeling toward her. It's a very difficult book to read. And so I felt like I was following after her into the Gestapo headquarters and into the Pforzheim prison, and finally to Dachau. And, so as I say, I resisted reading it, but in the end, it really brought me closer to her, because until then I had not dared come that close. And since then, she's been, hovering over me, guiding me, and even guiding me to discover writings of hers that previously weren't known.
Yep, so which is what I'm going to actually bring up now, is that Pirzia has really made it his mission to find these archives, which you are still finding, which is amazing. Because I guess after the war, what happened to the paperwork? Who took them? I think it was Sheikh Masha. It was your father, the uncles. They looked after many of the things when the family left, isn't it?
Well, they were then in Holland.
Mike, sorry.
They were then in Holland, and this connection with France was completely cut by the occupation. So they didn't know much about it. It was rather that the younger son, Inayat, he transferred much of the papers and documents at Vazemense to Holland, to those home people where they used to be staying. They had a large accommodation, headquarters, and so on. So much of what he took from Vazemense was later retrieved there in that archive.
Right.
Now part of the Sufi Museum there.
Yeah. That's amazing. What a treasure. So recently, some of you may have been there, Pirzia has found some poems she's written, but also not just the children's stories. He has discovered that her essays written as a young adult, and he's brought them out. And most interestingly is a play she did, and I'm going to let Pirzia describe it. She did a Sufi interpretation of the Odyssey. And Pirzia, will you summarize it for us? What she did with the characters, who inspired her?
Well, it's a fascinating work of art. The title is Aid of the Ocean and Land, and as you say, it's a retelling of the Odyssey, and it functions on multiple rhetorical levels. So on one level, it is a retelling of the Odyssey. On another level, it's a Sufi allegory, or you might say a Neoplatonic retelling of the Odyssey, which picks up on ways in which Neoplatonic philosophers were interpreting Homer. But specifically, she guides those interpretations in the direction of a Sufi allegory that follows the story of the Conference of the Birds, told by Attar, Sheikh Fariduddin Attar. So there are 7 acts that correspond to the 7 valleys of Attar's great Persian Sufi poem. But it also works on yet another level, which is the autobiographical level. Mm-hmm. And if you know her life story well, then it becomes very clear that she's also talking about her relationship with her father. And Odysseus, Iulus in the story, is her father Murshid, this traveling Sufi teacher. Iulus is a traveler who finally comes home, and her father in 1926 had finally come home after long travels. He had been in the United States and came home only briefly, only then to leave for India. And that was a journey from which he would not return. And so she was processing his absence and the final moments that she had spent with him. And she fit that experience into a mythic narrative where, in her telling of the Odyssey, Odysseus doesn't come back and vanquish the suitors and frankly torture the servants that had cooperated with the suitors, as happens in Homer's telling, but instead renounces his own estate and becomes a sannyasin, becomes a Sufi sage. And so she saw him as going to India in order to find a freedom that hadn't hitherto been possible for him. But in doing so, she felt that he made the great sacrifice of leaving the family that was so dear to him, and he was so dear to them. And so in her resolution of that story, the family of Odysseus, Penelope and Telemachus, the son of Odysseus representing Noor
herself,
follow after Odysseus, and together they roam in the wilderness. They find a new way of being together that is free of the former attachments and all of the complications of mundane life that had proved a kind of prison. And they find a way to, you might say, spiritually travel. And I interpret this as her realization of a way of being with the spirit of her father, a way of being that was now unfettered and would enable them to spiritually voyage together into the great blue.
And in fact, these books are now available thanks to PGCI bringing them out through the Suluk Academy. So, I think they can be bought on Amazon, can't they?
Dream Flowers is the title.
Dream Flowers is the collection of her essays, her short stories. It's actually like the collected works, which is absolutely fabulous. So, tell us about the name, Dream Flowers.
Well,
the cover, where she's in this tartan, tell us that story.
Oh, yes, the cover. Yes, well, there are 2 different editions with different covers, but so the title comes from a poem in which she speaks about sweet peas, and she says, "Flowers of my sweetest dreams." And that I love that phrase, so we used it as the title of the book, Dream Flowers. And the cover of the first edition shows her on horseback, wearing her uniform. I think it's
there's a Scottish, there's
uniform?
a tartan.
Yes, the tartan also.
Yeah.
So the story goes that Claire, whom you mentioned, Kheronisa, she saw Noor for the last time in an underground station. They happened to meet there, and it just turned out that was the last time those 2 sisters met. But Claire asked Noor, "Where have you been? What have you been doing?" And briefly she said, "I've been riding." I suppose that was part of her training. She had been riding on the downs, and she said, look for me after the war. I'll be riding the downs with our family tartan. So it came time to commission a portrait of Noor, and I thought, how will we portray her now that she's no more in this world? And I thought, let's portray her as she imagined herself after the war. What should we be doing? So according to the teachings of her father, when a soul leaves this world, something of this life continues, and it continues according to the anticipation and desire and hope of that soul. So if she said that after this war I'm going to be riding the downs, then I truly believe that in heaven that's what she's doing. And so we portrayed her that way and wearing that lavender tartan.
So is there a family tartan that you have?
It went from her mother's side, and
Okay.
she had a Scottish background, and so we traced it.
So
and
you
it was
traced
the
that.
lavender, yeah.
Okay, wow. So before we go into what you describe as the darker side to her story, I just wanted to ask, I want Sheikh Almar Sheikh, and who was there as a child, I just want you to recreate for everybody, what was the atmosphere like in Fazl Manzil? I mean, this music and the meditation that we hear about,
Yes.
a happy place. Just tell us about it.
Yes, well, the atmosphere was quite an extraordinary one. And it was, the curious thing was exactly that same. It happened in our family when later we moved to Holland. But the same thing, that the uncles, the father and the uncles were there. And they had that extraordinary Indian sense of being. They were great mystics, they were great philosophers, and they were focused on all the spiritual values of India. And in addition, of course, it was perfectly natural for them to speak their language, to adopt, continue the habits, the mentality, the attitudes, the behavior, everything would have been normal for them. So that was really the dominant atmosphere as long as Murshid Inayat Khan and his brothers lived together. Mm-hmm. Then, of course, once Murshid left, and around that same time also the brothers left that joint family because, my father had married, two of the brothers had married, one had joined those others when they left. So suddenly Fazl Manzil was a very different place, where the mother, Amina Begum, Sharda, alternative name was, became filled with memories, but filled with a kind of sadness. And the mother was almost incapable of continuing a kind of conscious education of these young children. And that was what then fell to Noor, who herself was only maybe 13 or 14 years old, to try to steer the younger children in a more or less normal life of children of that age would expect. But of course the transition from that one atmosphere which was wholly authentically Indian, and suddenly that evaporating, and it's a kind of modulation in tone, and it was of course a very hard thing. They continued, of course, as much as possible, continue the memory and the practices and whatever they knew of their father. But still, of course, it was a very, I would say it was an operation without anesthetics. That is what that loss was. And so then they had more or less had to fend for themselves. Their uncles being in Holland, they used to come and visit them there, but it still was not the same thing as being together in a joint family, of course. And so each of them had to strike out on their own. And of course, both Noor Nissa and her brother Vilayat were the most capable, the most charismatic, the most talented people. They most consciously chose a way of their own. And that continued. As I said, Noor started writing little chits to the family in India. Her father had already encouraged her to do so. She continued that. Very few of these chits have somehow survived time and are still now, have still been preserved, and most of them after the time of Murshid Inayat Khan himself. And so that was one link which they had, feeling that yes, there were the origin, there was their Asliat, their genuine background, and so he reached out to that. And on the other hand, of course, they were trained in music, they were trained academically at the same time. Both Vilayat and Noor had this dual higher education that again gave them a certain togetherness, but at the same time, each is a particular specialism. Vilayat studied cello, he studied with ghazals and celebrities of that time. And Noor, of course, played harp, she played piano, and so on and so on. So, yes, there was a kind of a next phase in which the children kind of, as much as possible, retained, as far as they could, of their father's atmosphere, of his memory, of his way of doing things, etc. But still, of course, having to maneuver. After all, they were half American and they lived in a very modern France, which is rather different if you are an old-fashioned India, you come from 19th century India. So obviously, there was a lot of adaptation they needed, a lot of trial and error. Where can I do something about my Indian heritage, and where do I have to proceed on my own, etc. It was a very difficult position, really. And
Noor used to compose, isn't it? So, in fact, you found some of her compositions, and to see these manuscripts with her writing and then signed Noor Nisa, and her compositions, it's just beautiful to see them. So, thank you for finding these. They're like treasures, which I just look at sometimes. In her neat handwriting, she's sort of done the notes and everything. It's beautiful. So we're going to move on to, we don't have much time. I know there's lots of questions, so I'll probably make this maybe the last one from my side and then open it up. So when, we're talking about the influence of her family, her father's teachings, I always felt that when she was in Forza prison and she was shackled, 10 months beaten and tortured, and the way she kept her spirits up, she must have meditated and thought about her father. And that is the only way she would have got through that. I mean, what do you think? I'm a lay, outsider just seeing this, but I'd love to hear from you.
Yes. Well, her father, as you know, was a teacher of meditation and a very serious practitioner of meditation. And the methodology he used is one that it derives from Indian tradition, and it reflects Sufism as it evolved in the environment of yoga and Vedanta and Buddhism. The whole culture of India is meditative, and in fact there's been a lot of cross-pollination and mutual influence between the various traditions, and Sufism was part of that ongoing culture for centuries. And so she was steeped in that heritage and absorbed it with her mother's milk, so to speak. It was in the air. So meditation was part of her being. And so not only would she have been raised to believe in the soul, but she was raised to actually experience the soul and to experience a dimension of life that includes but also transcends our physical condition. And so she would be able to experience her suffering within that larger context. That's not to say that she wouldn't have suffered. She suffered terribly. But at the same time, she was able to have recourse to a dimension of being that precedes this body and survives this body and inheres throughout, no matter what we're going through, in a state that isn't determined by the accidents befalling our physical form. It has its own sphere of light and life, and no doubt she was able to tune into it and gain solace and gain motive power from her soul. And I can't think of how else anyone could have shown as much courage and determination as she did.
Mm-hmm. Because despite all that, she never gave away anything. She did not break. And I mean, I'm not judging, but there were male colleagues of hers who gave away names, because one is not judging. You don't know what you can do under, when you're Nazi interrogation and torture. So, but they did. And the point is that Noor didn't. And even when she went down, I mean, you know, you do say it is a dark story. Of course it is. But for me, at the end of it, when she goes down shouting liberty, I think that's it. You know, that was the inspiration. So for me, her story, it goes beyond that darkness to light, much like her name. And, you know, I'd love to hear yours.
Oh, you know, the remarkable thing is the very first publication of Inayat Khan in English, which was a very much kind of a catechism of Sufism as he learned it from his own teacher, had a slight kind of volume. But he called it a Sufi message of spiritual liberty. Now we know what Sufism is, what the Sufi message is, but he again combined the two great traditions, because liberty is the way in Hinduism you define the ultimate fulfillment. So here again, already Inayat Khan's first book was based on that togetherness of the Indian and the Indian Sufi tradition, combining these two great traditions. And her last word was precisely that same word of liberty that, for them marked the kind of the fulfillment of spiritual life and the spiritual search for ultimate reality. So I find it very, very significant and very inspiring that that should have been her last consciousness in meeting her in that way.
That's a fantastic place to now open the floor. If there are questions, we have about 10 minutes for questions. Less than 10, yes.
Can you tell us anything about the grandparents?
Sorry, 1 second, just about online videos.
Can you tell us anything about the grandparents of Noor and whether they, in different ways, influenced her development? Grandparents.
Not directly, because the grandparents in India had died long before that. Inayat Khan did not leave India before, as long as his parents were alive. And only after his father died, then he felt free to travel abroad. So that was, and of course, well, his their American family on the mother's side was quite against everything that this Indian marrying our American daughter. So that was no contact either. But one thing was there, and that's one thing which I know very well because it happened in our case, my sister myself also. They were full of stories, and daily, not only they had this meditation, but something of their whole life stream was involved with the memory of the family in India, and that was very much included their parents and included their maternal grandfather, who was the head of the whole family, the kind of patriarch. And so, precisely, as I said, as long as they were there together, those stories, they continued, and they continued with the children. I often remember the people had asked me, how was this and how was that, and do you know about? So they were still involved with the memory of that Indian background.
Maybe I'll just briefly add something to that, which is that I recently had the opportunity to meet a lady who knew Noor as a child. She had been a student of Noor because at Fazl Manzil, at her father's house, she used to give Sufi classes when she was in her 20s. And Sufi children used to come and listen to her, and there were various subjects. And one of the subjects was a lesson, the title of which was Little Inayat. And so her father's name was Inayat, and this was Little Inayat. So it was a lesson about how, when her father was a child, what he had been taught by his parents. And she said, you know, Little Inayat was told not to follow people around when they don't want your company, and little things like that. And she was reflecting something that her father told her that his parents told him. And so it passed down the generations that way. Yeah. That's right.
In some commentaries about Noor, her suitability is questioned, and sometimes some unkind things are said about her. I think some of these things actually, her strengths were saying about, you know, she didn't give anything away, and in her training, things were said like she didn't want to lie, that kind of thing. So I wonder whether you would reflect upon those criticisms, actually they can be turned into strengths, but also maybe if there were some concerns that perhaps she shouldn't have been sent, and was it because of her, her bilingualism, etc., desperation? I just wondered how you thought about that, because I wonder today whether we'd have sent her at all. We'd have said, no, actually, there's something else that you can do, whether we were desperate and she shouldn't have gone.
Shrabini, you've been asking the questions, but you're the one who has really detailed knowledge of Noor's wartime career. I would like to turn to you, if I may.
I can answer that. Yeah. Well, basically, yes, there were objections to her because she was not a typical spy. She was an unlikely spy, somebody who says, I'm not going to lie. I mean, you're going there with a false passport. So that's the first lie. So yes, but Noor was pragmatic. And I think what happened is there was this impression of her that, she's a dreamer. She'll never do what, she might let down the side. She might give away things. She might be she'll be so nervous, so tense. This dreamer, this, petite woman cannot face the Gestapo. And I can see why people thought that. Many in her training school. She was scared of weapons, so her report says scared of weapons. Obviously, she would be. But in the same report, it says, but tries very hard. So I see Noor as somebody who knew that, okay, she didn't want to do it, but she felt she had to do it, and she was going to train. The same reports say she is very loyal, she runs very hard, spends a lot of time on physical activity, training herself. So she knew what she had to do. And I think many of her seniors saw that side to her. They saw the steely side. They knew that Noor had an inner strength, which was, there was we saw later that she did not crack. So they saw that side to her. Of course, the other thing that went against her, which people objected to, was that she was very beautiful. And as a secret agent, you're supposed to blend, not have the whole turn, have a room turn as you enter, as they say. And that's what she would do. One of her interpreters says he melted to chutney when she walked into the room. So, that's not ideal in that sense. But of course, she was there. She did what she had to in the field. If she hadn't been betrayed, she'd have been back and we'd have heard her story. So, and of course, there were mistakes made we can't go into all the details, but it's in the book, but there were many mistakes made in London headquarters where her messages were not dealt with properly. So there were a lot of repercussions from that, some very tragic repercussions, but those were not Noor's fault. So hopefully that answers something. Sorry, are you? No. Yes, anybody else with any other questions? Burning queries? You're not going to get both of them on a platform here together very quickly. So if any questions which may not be related, is on Sufism, on philosophy, here's your chance. I see a hand. I don't know who it is.
Thank you so much. I was wondering when Pir Inayat Khan was in London around 1917 to 1920, whether we have found any archival material about the Islamic associations he was involved in those days. Thank you.
Yes, so basically, actually we have the expert here, Kahira, can tell you what she has been researching. Would you like to take that? Yeah, because you're the expert. I mean, I know that he gave concerts during the First World War, because I wrote a book on the First World War, and he's in the records there. He gave concerts to the Indian soldiers. He sang before Gandhi and brought tears to Gandhi's eyes. And but I just know a little bit, but Kahira can tell you more.
Okay, well, I'll try. Thank you. So he, as well as doing the musical evenings and a developing group of followers for his teachings, he did set up an association called the Anjuman Islam, which was to help, I think, mainly Indian Muslims coming to London and giving them a welcome and a basis. And also there was a magazine that was produced 1915 to 1920, where there were notices about asking for donations for the Anjuman Islam and also for an orphanage. So I wasn't quite sure in terms of the question. Was it particularly about his work with Islam during London?
Yes, it is.
Ye-
I have come across references to his supporting the fund for Indian soldiers and their widows,
Okay.
and that he came under suspicion of the authorities for that involvement.
So, certainly, as Shrabani said, he and his brothers performed for the Indian soldiers, and there was a story about when he was improvising one song that it was taken as being supporting the national movement of independence in India, and so they were not invited to continue that further. There's also the story of, there is a file in the British Library, and it was partly his wife's family sent someone to seek out his wife who had left her family in America. And there was also letters between the Secretary of State for India and the police. But once it was discovered that they were legally married and everything was fine, I think the following stopped. But there is a wonderful story about them being followed by someone when they went to France, and finally they turned around and asked for advice as to where they should stay. And this man, who was following them, I don't know whether it was for the police or for MI5, took them to a certain place and therefore was able to keep them under his eye for a certain amount of time.
In fact, one of the reasons they left London actually was because they said it's free. France is friendlier. You're better off there, and then that's how they moved. One last question before we. Okay, yeah. And this will be the last, so you better make it good. No pressure.
So that was a really very moving and very touching discussion. I'm just referring back to Shabani, the earlier event in which the High Commissioner spoke about, the multicultural element of Noor's family, both in terms of, the beautiful Sufi background that she comes from, as well as the, her mother having both a Hindu name as well as a Christian name and all. Could you just shed some light on, because that was news to me, so that multicultural, and I think she wrote a book on Buddhist Jataka tales as well, didn't she? So there's a beautiful element of multiculturalism that comes through. Anything that you can shed some light on, that'd be lovely to hear. Thank you.
Well, you did cover it. I mean, it is her family, of course. Her father's Indian, her mother's American. She's born in Moscow, comes to London, lives in Paris. I mean, that's it in a summary. You can see it's an international family. And because her father is lighting a candle to every religion every day, he starts this universal worship. So, there is this atmosphere of tolerance. And I'm saying what Peer Zia should be saying, but I'm saying it very quickly because it's the last question. But yes, and when Noor, well, apparently she had a friend, Jean, and Jean said that she used to say that after the war, she'd love to be some sort of ambassador, UN, because the UN didn't really exist then, but she said she'd love to be an ambassador to bring countries together. I don't think she believed in borders, and she was an international person, and she wanted to use that skill. So she was multicultural. She was, there were no borders for Noor. She was an international person, and I think that's important. But would any of you like to say one last thing before we end today?
I don't think so. I should.
Okay. Well, you've said a lot, and it's just been wonderful. So thank you, Peer Zia. Thank you, Sheikh Moshek. What a treat. We have the hall for about half an hour for some drinks, and you can chat with them. So feel free to wander and talk. Thank you. Thank you all so much.